Hello, this is Eric Tridas. It is a pleasure to be presenting at the Congreso da DISLEX in Porto, Portugal. What we're going to cover today is the factors that contribute to the clinical presentation in children with dyslexia, how to identify them early on, what the neurology of dyslexia is, and how we manage it. When evaluating children with dyslexia, the first thing that we try to ascertain is the areas of impairment. We measure areas of impairment in four primary ways: work, which in the child's case is school; behavior and emotional regulation; social relationships; and health. When I evaluate my patients, my first thought is that if the child is not doing poorly in school, if his behavior is not disruptive at home or in the classroom, if he's getting along well with other children and he's healthy, he's not having very many problems. What we call it is not important unless we're looking for services. The clinical presentation is really the product of four contributing factors: the child's learning style, the child's behavioral style, health factors, and the environment. What we see in terms of impairment is the combination of all of those four factors, very similar to what we see when we put a recipe together. For example, in the child with dyslexia, if we were to compare him or her to a chocolate cake, the chocolate of this child would be his reading difficulties. However, we need to look at multiple other factors that contribute to the clinical presentation in the same fashion that we look at the other ingredients that would be combined to make a cake. In this case, we look not only at the learning style of the child, but the child's behavior and emotional profile and his ability to cope and deal with the difficulties that he's having, or to find out if there are other factors that would be contributing from the behavior and emotional standpoint to his clinical presentation. Health concerns and the environment will also be critical. We will be covering those later in our discussion. If we have a good description of the contributing factors to the clinical presentation, we will be able to formulate a good prescription to manage them. The management of these problems can be divided into four areas: educational management, psychological management, medical management, and environmental management. The combination of these four modalities of intervention are more likely to lead to a positive outcome. In looking at the contributing factors to the clinical presentation, the first thing that we're going to look at is a developmental profile. If you think of the brain as a factory where you will have to bring raw materials in to be processed into a product that will then have to be stored and finally will have to be retrieved and set into a distribution network, that may help you understand how information is processed in the brain. The information will come to the brain through the sensory system, and in entering the brain, that raw data is going to go through four areas. The first one would be the child's mental age. If you have a child with a mental age of a 3-year-old and you're trying to introduce material that is appropriate for a child who's 6 years of age, that information will not be processed appropriately. Attention will also play a major role in the ability to process information. If you think as attention as having a guard who is manning a gate, we need to make sure that the guard is attending to the traffic coming in, that the gate is closed when it needs to be closed, and that it's open when it needs to be open. So we're looking at the child's ability not only to pay attention, but to regulate the function of attention. Is the child paying attention to the right thing at the right time for the appropriate amount of time, as in depth as he needs to? We also need to look at the type of task that is coming in. Is the task a sequential one or a simultaneous task? Many language tasks tend to be sequential. Words are sequences of sounds. You change the sequence of those sounds, you change the meaning of the word. As opposed to processing information visually, such as looking at a watch or a pencil, where all of the attributes are processed at the same time and we understand what this instruments are used for, whether they're expensive or inexpensive, what they're made of, etc. Finally, we look at processing speed. While we may have a child who has the mental age of a 15-year-old, if his processing speed is very slow, we will have congestion of traffic in that highway, and the information is not going to come in a very efficient fashion. As I mentioned previously, the input into the brain comes through the sensory system. Of the 5 senses that we have, we use 3 for processing information at school. We use sight, hearing, and the sense of touch and position. Smell and taste are not very effective in helping us learn from books. Translating that raw data into meaningful information is what we call processing. Once the data is processed, it has to be stored. And the storage facility of the brain is our memory system. We have 3 different kinds of memory: short-term, working, and long-term memory. Retrieving the information from there, we will then have to set up a distribution network. And that's the output of the system. The output will either be oral or written. And that product will leave the factory through the same highway that it came in. So the individual's mental age, attention, the speed of processing, and the nature of the task will play a major role. Let's look at some of the sensory information that comes in. We talked about the visual system. Having a visual perceptual problem will have an impact on how the information is organized in space, whether or not it's placed in the right order, etc. Just imagine how difficult it would be to have to read information in this manner. A child that presents with difficulties in the viewing of information as it's represented in the 4th bullet here may also have a great deal of difficulty lining numbers up for multi-digit multiplication and long division. The processing of visual information will also be very important in processing concepts such as maps, geometric forms, etc. The second component is language. And language is the primary dysfunction area in reading. Language has multiple components. The most basic unit of language is a sound. The study of the sounds that make the words or language is phonology. The second area that we look at is semantics, the meaning of the words. We look at morphology, the construction of the words. What happens with suffixes and prefixes? For example, in English, if we put the letters ing at the end of the word, it usually implies that is a verb. So if I say running, we're talking about a verb. If we refer to it in the past, in English we would use a suffix, usually the word would end in ed. So I finished would represent the past. Many children recognize those patterns early on. If I add a prefix of un before the word common, we would make it the opposite. Or if we use the prefix a before the word typical, it would make it the opposite. Syntax is the organization of the words into sentences so that they will make sense. Discourse is the combination of sentences into larger units, such as paragraphs. So as you see, language is a very sequential task. A sequence of sounds will make a word, a sequence of words a sentence, and a sequence of sentences a paragraph. Metalinguistics and pragmatic skills are the more abstract aspects of language. Metalinguistics is understanding how a language works. It's what allows us to understand the humor in a word, what